Groningen, as is my colleague Daphne Brandenburg, who is joining me on the stage tonight. So this is a Studium Generale event. Studium Generale organises lectures, debates, and other types of events that explore a wide range of academic, cultural, and social topics for a broad audience. It aims to foster curiosity and critical thinking by connecting university knowledge with societal issues. Today, we are welcoming philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah to Groningen and to our stage. This is the last stop on Professor Appiah's whistle-stop tour of the Netherlands, having spoken in Maastricht and Tilburg earlier this week, and we are delighted that he is able to join us tonight. In a moment, I will briefly introduce our guest. We will then have a conversation with the three of us for about an hour about issues of identity and ethics, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. And I've also been asked to remind you that after the talk, we have bookstore Godert Walter here, and Professor Appiah is happy to sign your books. So
even if I didn't write them.
Even if you didn't write them. So with no further ado, let me introduce our guest for tonight. Kwame Anthony Appiah is a Ghanaian British-American philosopher, now based at New York University, where he teaches philosophy and law. He was born in London in 1954 and raised in Ghana. He earned his PhD in philosophy from Clare College, Cambridge, and has held prestigious academic positions at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. He's received a litany of awards and honors for his work, including the prestigious National Humanities Medal in 2011, the Spinoza Lens Prize for his contribution to ethics and society in 2016, and most recently, in 2024, the John W. Klug Prize for achievement in the study of humanity, awarded by the Library of Congress. Professor Appiah also appreciates the role of philosophy in public life and writes the ethicist column for the New York Times Magazine. So if you have any moral dilemmas that you can't quite solve, maybe tonight is the time to pose them. Professor Appiah's work is known for its interdisciplinary approach, blending philosophy with history, cultural studies, and politics. And he has published multiple books, both works of philosophy and novels. Some of the texts that will inform our discussion tonight are his 2005 book, The Ethics of Identity, which examines collective identities such as race, nationality, religion, gender, and sexuality, asking to what extent these constrain our freedom and to what extent they enable our individuality. In light of Tuesday's election, we would be remiss not to speak about his 2006 book, Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers, which argues for a global ethics based on shared values across cultures. And we'll also touch on themes from his 2008 book, Experiments in Ethics, his 2010 monograph, The Honor Code, How Moral Revolutions Happen, as well as discussing his most recent book, the excellently titled The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity from 2018. So with lots to talk about, we better get started, and Daphne has our first set of questions.
Yes, thank you, Charlotte. So about experiments in ethics, I wanted to start there. In many countries, they're defunding the humanities. And one might say there's a general trend to encourage students to train in the sciences rather than the humanities. Now, as a devil's advocate, I might think that maybe to some extent that's justified, because maybe the sciences render fields like ethics or political philosophy obsolete. The thought would then be that what we think is wrong or right, or what we think is just or unjust, ultimately depends on our psychologies, our biology, and also making people act better or do better is better based on psychological findings than it is done by means of providing them with moral arguments. You've responded to this challenge, so can you tell us what you think the relationship between science and philosophy is?
Well, so in the long history of the word philosophy in Europe, of course, what we now call science emerges from natural philosophy. And so the word philosophy would have been, Newton was a professor of natural philosophy. So that one way of understanding what's happened in that history, I think, is that various questions have budded off at various points, because in a process that accelerated in the late 19th century, academic fields specialized and developed distinctive techniques and theoretical traditions and so on. And that all seems fine to me. We've made a lot of progress on certain questions precisely by narrowing the work that certain people do. Though it's very important to remember about the current state of the natural sciences that there's lots and lots of interdisciplinary work in the sciences, and that on the one hand people specialize, but on the other hand they then collaborate with one of my friends works in neuroscience, but he's a quantum physicist. The mathematical tools that he learned in order to study the questions in physics, it turned out to be very useful in studying the brain. Many sort of wet brain people who work with brains, actual brains, as opposed to theoretical models of brains, don't have enough mathematics to do that. So as it were, in a way, what we are still doing in the philosophy departments is, as it were, what's left. As you know.
But what is left?
Good. So one thing that's inevitable. Well, there are two very important things that I think this process misses. One is, it's great to focus down, but then to use that knowledge, you have to use it as a person, and a person needs knowledge for all kinds of different things. I need biological knowledge, physical knowledge. I need to know geography in order to get from Maastricht to Tilburg to Groningen, and so on. So that's one thing. You need people who are interested in how it all fits together. It's one thing to have people who really understand this piece of the puzzle, but the puzzle is a big puzzle. And we need to figure out how somebody needs to be thinking about how these things fit together. But the other set of things that I think inevitably remains is a set of normative questions, because the appropriate method for understanding the answer to a normative question is not experimental science. Now, philosophers dispute about why that is, because they have different so-called meta-ethical theories. They have different theories about how to understand the content of ethical judgment. But I don't think they dispute that fact. There are very few. There are some non-philosophers, some of them with best-selling books, who don't seem to grasp this. So I think there are these normative questions that the appropriate method for understanding them is a different kind of approach. However, as I argued in the book Experiments in Ethics, when you're bringing normative knowledge to bear, you can't do so with a complete blindness to what the human beings who are going to operate those normative systems are actually like. It would be, you could have a normative theory that recommended doing something, and then it could turn out that it was something that human beings couldn't do, right? And that would be a relevant fact. And a lot of, also, a lot of our sort of normative knowledge is the sort of thing, Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics says that the generalizations of ethics are true for the most part. They're not, even the shape of the truths of ethics seems to me different from the shape of the general truths in many of the natural sciences or in the social sciences and psychology. So somebody's going to end up doing those things, but they shouldn't do it blind to what's being learned all the time about moral psychology as a descriptive discipline and so on.
So when we ask questions like, what would a just society look like, or how to live, how to treat others, those are not questions we can just answer by doing research, but they are constrained, or they should be informed by research about what human beings can actually do. Or
and I think
feasible.
That was the normal view among the people we call philosophers until that you should be in dialogue with the best science of your day. That was the normal view of most of the philosophers. It was Hume's view, it was Kant's view. Kant gave lectures on anthropology as well as on ethics and metaphysics. It was John Stuart Mill's view. It was John Dewey's view. It was Elizabeth Anscombe's view, I think. A thing happened, especially in the English-speaking world in philosophy in the mid-20th century, or just before starting roughly before the Second World War in the 1930s, I think, which was the development of in that process of professionalization that I said has occurred in all intellectual activity, there was a kind of philosophy developed that professionalized itself as answering those questions which could be answered by pure conceptual analysis, unafflicted with knowledge of the world.
Science.
And that was part of the self-understanding of so-called analytic philosophy. I think this was a bad idea. Mm-hmm. I don't mean that there aren't conceptual questions, but even conceptual questions need to be thought about in the context of general knowledge about the world, scientific knowledge about the world, the best knowledge we have about whatever the things are. And maybe we can exemplify that when we come to talk about identity.
Yeah, we'll get to identity, but I also want to relate to that talking about your work on cosmopolitanism. A cosmopolitan, among other things, you say, is someone who has a responsibility to the entire planet and all the people in it. Unfortunately, there aren't many cosmopolitans around today. Oh. We see many countries, political movements increasingly turning inwards and feeling responsible only, to look after their own, to respect their own, whatever that might exactly mean. And Jonathan Haidt and other psychologists, for example, have suggested that this actually has a lot to do with our psychologies, right? And our tendency to care about in-groups and our own tribe. Now, maybe uncharitably, but one might say that this maybe teaches us that cosmopolitanism isn't a feasible ideal. Would you agree?
Guess what my answer to that question is. I mean, look, I'm precisely interested in a feasible cosmopolitanism,
right.
And so there is in the history. This is a very old word. Cosmopolitas is a word that Diogenes used to describe himself about the time he met Alexander the Great, so a long time ago. And of course, it means etymologically being a polites, a citizen of the cosmos, of the world. Mm-hmm. In your language, you can say Wereldburger, something like that.
Wereldburger, yeah.
Yes, that's just what a cosmopolitan is. Now, when Diogenes said that, he knew perfectly well that he couldn't be a citizen of the world because there wasn't a polis to be a citizen of. There wasn't a cosmopolis. So he had to mean something metaphorical by it. Mm-hmm. And the history of cosmopolitanism is the history of how to interpret that metaphor. What is it to treat everybody in the world in a way that's a little bit like the way you treat your fellow citizens? And even if you have that thought, there are clearly going to be very many different ways of developing it, because it's a metaphor. It's something has to be developed. There are people who develop it in a way that I think is infeasible, because they contrast universal respect with the kind of particular engagements that we have with our family and our friends and our towns and our nations and our churches and our temples and so on. And they use the word cosmopolitan as a name for resistance to those. So that's a mistake, I think. Not least because it's infeasible. I think it's a mistake for other reasons as well. But it's at least a mistake because it's infeasible. Because that's not what we're like. And furthermore, you would not want to have friends who were like that. Who wants to have friends who say, with a kind of impartialism, right? They say, well, it's true that you, my friend, have needs, but everybody has needs. When I look at you, I think, yes, let's say, her utility matters, but so does your utility, and so does the utility of 100 million people in Bangladesh. So I will give you your fair share of attention, which is 1/8 billionth of the share of attention that everybody's entitled to. So why, and there is a pressure in certain kinds of moral thinking in that direction. And it ends up, that's where utilitarianism ends up, right?
Yeah.
It ends up saying, well, everybody matters to exactly the same extent, and furthermore, they matter only and as bearers of this thing called utility, which you can have theories of. Well, so a better way, I think, of understanding the right way to think about global citizenship is a way that is modeled by the relationship between your sense of yourself as people in Groningen, right?
Yeah.
Which is that, I mean, not everybody in Groningen feels like this, but some feel, this is my town, I care about this place, I care about what happens to it, I care to participate in what happens here, I care to sustain what happens here, and I don't feel like that about Tilburg. I have nothing against Tilburg, but it's not my town, right? And I feel like this about New York City, right? I care more about New York City, where I live, than the average city in the United States. Mm-hmm. It's not that I don't care about Chicago, but I don't care about Chicago in the way that you care about your city. Mm-hmm. And I don't care about Illinois, where Chicago is, in the way that I care about New York State, which is my state. I vote for the governor of New York State. People in Illinois vote for the governor of Illinois. That's what they should be doing, but I shouldn't be. I should be focused. So, in other words, we have nested citizenships within the nation, right? Mm-hmm. I'm a New Yorker, both in the city sense and in the state sense. I'm also an American. And I have other national connections. But those, so I think we just need to think of the proper form of cosmopolitanism as one that treats our global responsibilities as another nested level.
Yeah.
And if you think that way, then you do need to ask yourself, since you can't attend to everybody in the world the way I do attend to the problem. I don't think about homelessness in Calcutta the way I think about homelessness in New York. Both are, it's a worse problem in Calcutta. So maybe, the utilitarian should say focus on that.
Focus on that, yeah.
But it's my city.
Okay.
So that seems to me, so you need to answer the question, well, what do you owe at the general level? And I think actually I can give you a formula, but applying the formula requires plugging in answers to a lot of different questions. But the formula, I think, is simple. You owe your fair share to make sure that everybody in the world is able to live a life of dignity. That's what you owe to everybody in the world. But you don't owe more than your fair share. So one important set of ethical questions are questions about what your fair share is.
Yeah.
And those are exactly the kind of question where you need to know some facts. Because what it takes to live a life of dignity is something that we can study. We can see what kinds of political arrangements, what kinds of laws turn out to conduce to that. And so one reason why it's hard to figure out what your fair share is, it's really hard to figure out what's needed in order that everybody should live a life of dignity. And that is not, there are normative dimensions of that which are decided by ethical reflection, but there are many other things that are relevant.
And do you think, so if I, as a cosmopolitan, wanted to do my fair share, so do you think this is an individual responsibility to figure that out, or because it sounds very complicated? So how do we become good cosmopolitans?
Okay. So that's one thing where, again, I think the approach, the utilitarian approach, is very unhelpful, because the utilitarian approach says, here's your answer, maximize utility.
Yeah.
And my first thought about maximizing utility would be, well, I don't know what I can do to maximize utility unless I know what anybody else is going to be doing, right? So often, when we're thinking about what our fair share is, the right approach is to identify institutions and structures that we can participate in that are aiming at some thing that's useful for human dignity.
Right.
It's not something that I have to work out by myself. I couldn't work it out by myself because what the right answer is for me is contingent upon what a whole bunch of other people are going to do.
Right. Okay. So brief follow-up on cosmopolitanism, and then so what I find interesting about your notion of cosmopolitanism as well is that you say, so we associate this with being a citizen of the world and a member of the community of the world, but you do stress it doesn't mean that we're suddenly all having the same identity or that this community is very uniform, homogeneous. Actually, cosmopolitanism involves respecting legitimate differences. So can you tell us a bit more about what those legitimate differences are, and also how we can respect those without betraying our own principles or values?
Right. So the part of cosmopolitanism we were talking about until now is a set of claims about our normative obligations, which is not limited to cosmopolitans. I think everybody has those obligations. But there is something distinctive about the way the cosmopolitan thinks about these things. The cosmopolitan thinks about them as involving a form of life in which engagement with people who are different from yourself, from other places, and also from other positions in your own society, is something you value and, I would say, take pleasure in. There's a kind of pleasure indifference that is the psychological side of cosmopolitanism, as opposed to the moral side, which is just, as it were, demanding in the way morality is. So, what does that mean?
But it's legitimate difference. So I want
Correct.
to notice the word.
So good. So there are two things I think I want to say about deciding which difference is legitimate.
Right.
One is, and I really do think that this is part of the long tradition of cosmopolitanism, as you see it, for example, in someone like Montaigne. One important sort of thought is fallibilism, right? There are certain things that everybody ought to do. I have a view about that. Other people have a different view. It's extremely unlikely that I'm correct about all of the things that I think, and they're incorrect about all the ones where they disagree with me. Of course, if I knew which ones were incorrect, I would change my mind and shift to the correct view. But I know that I don't have the correct view about everything. That's an important place where the cosmopolitan... And that's part of what you learn by engaging with people all over the place. You see, well, gosh, it turns out to be possible to hold this view. Yeah. I'll give you an example. I mean, one of the reasons it's sort of easier for me to be a cosmopolitan is because I grew up in two rather different places. But in Asante, which is where my parents lived and where I spent... That was my home, even though I went to university in England, though my mother was English. Family is organized matrilineally. So your family is your mother's family. And as you probably know, in England, normatively, on average, your family is your father's family. I know the name of my 17th great-grandfather in England. I don't know the name of my grandmother's great-grandmother. He was called Sir Guillaume de Crisp, and he lived in Stanlake in Oxfordshire. All right. So, whereas in Asante, I know my matrilineal ancestors back to the early 18th century. And I'm named for a guy called Akramampim. I know I'm descended from his sister. And therefore, of course, from his mother. So, now, these seem to me, these are different ways of organizing a very important area of normative life, namely the family. But they both work, and what your obligations are depends on which one you're in. I have special obligations to my sister's children, because that's how males plug into matrilineal systems. They are engaged with their sister's children, so there's a special word in our language for a maternal uncle. And I have 3 sisters, so I have many people to whom I have to exercise these obligations.
Yeah.
So I couldn't avoid it by not having any children of my own. I could have asked my sisters not to have children, but I couldn't avoid it the other way. Whereas I think if you live in a patrilineal society, fathers have special obligations to their children. They should jolly well carry them out. I think that some of them should be legally enforceable, just as the obligations of maternal uncles ought to be legally enforceable in a place where that's the norm. Okay, so there are kinds of relativity that seem to be consistent. Now, notice, that's not relativistic in one way.
Yeah.
I say it is objectively correct in England that this is the way to behave in Ghana, and it is objectively correct in Ghana that that's the different way to behave in England.
Right.
So that's in a certain sense not relativist, though it's relative to something.
It's relative to community.
So that's the first point, that there are kinds of things where it seems to me morality leaves it open. Morality leaves it open that we have to have, every society has to have a way of thinking about the distribution of responsibilities for children, but there's not only one way to do that, and so you can do it in different ways.
And there are legitimate differences.
And there are legitimate differences there.
Yeah.
Second thing, so fallibilism, legitimate differences generated by the fact that that social facts put us in different moral relations to people. And then the third thing is that to the extent that we want actively to enforce certain universal standards, there's a right way, procedurally speaking, to go about it, which is to have respectful cross-cultural dialogue about what the right answer is.
Right. So even if we do disagree,
Yes.
it's still another thing to enforce what
Yes.
you think is right. That should happen through some sort of
And
respectful. So okay.
We've begun this process, right? I mean, the whole international human rights system, which was very imperial when it started. I mean, most of the countries of the world didn't exist when the UN Universal Declaration was created. I mean, Ghana was the Gold Coast. It wasn't a country. Or at least part of Ghana was the Gold Coast, since Ghana was made up of two countries that came together in 1957, as it happens. So the process was not ideal. No. But, and it can be improved. But I think that cross-cultural dialogue has produced a great deal of consilience about a lot of things. Interestingly, there continues to be serious dispute about some things in the domain of gender, which I think is connected with the fact that there are different ways of organizing family life, and some of those different ways of organizing family life are not legitimate.
Yeah.
Right?
And some people might say, whilst we're waiting for this respectful dialogue to be successful, people are suffering.
Correct.
So
yes.
maybe we should.
So yes, they are. But here's another place where I think feasibility is really important, and it's not. It's very widely ignored in the halls of NATO and the Defense Department in Washington. That something bad is going on is only a reason to intervene if you can make things better.
Right.
And much of the moral interventionism of military-based moral interventionism in the world just makes things worse. Things are worse in Libya since the world intervened. Things are worse in Iraq since the world intervened. Right. Things are worse in Syria, and so on. And so you have to think about, not about what it would be nice to have happen, but about what you have some chance of making
What's
happen.
feasible.
What's feasible. And I'll give you an example where in another kind of intervention, not military, right, profoundly counterproductive. So I don't think, I mean, let me go a little bit through this case because it's sort of interesting. People have strong feelings about female genital cutting, or mutilation as some people call it. First thing you need to do as a cosmopolitan in that context is figure out what's actually going on. Don't let people say, oh, they're mutilating the genitals of girls. Ask what they're actually doing. Mm-hmm. Turns out that expression is used to cover a very wide range of practices, some of which are very bad for girls and some of which are not very bad for girls, though I'm against most of them.
Most of them, yeah.
But you should focus on the ones that are really bad. And, clitoral excision is really bad. But that's not what all genital mutilation consists in. So you need to figure out, the first respectful thing is to figure out what's actually going on and to make sure you understand what's going on. In that case, in the 1930s, in colonial Kenya, the Scottish Presbyterian Church began a campaign against genital cutting for Maasai women. No, Gikuyu women. And what happened? The Gikuyu left the church. Genital cutting became an identity issue for Gikuyu.
Yeah.
And a practice that was dying out was reinforced.
Okay.
So if you're going to intervene, you have to intervene intelligently. There are successful anti-FGM campaigns in West Africa now, but they begin in a completely different way. They don't begin by coming in and insulting people and misunderstanding them. They begin by coming in and talking about health and human rights and waiting, it may take a couple of years, for the community themselves to say to you, maybe we shouldn't be doing this to our girls. And then they tell them some useful things about ways of stopping it that work. For example, if your daughters marry boys from over there, there's no point in stopping FGM here without consulting them, because then your daughters won't be marriageable.
Right. Yeah.
And that's a lesson that was learned in the fight against foot binding in China. So I think the reason the process matters is an empirical reason.
Right.
It's that people are more likely to get the point and to exit a bad practice if they're addressed about it in a way that's respectful and that pays attention to what's actually going on. Mm-hmm. So if I could stop this practice by flicking my fingers, well, I'd flick my fingers. But of course, if I could stop it by flicking my fingers, somebody would probably start it by flicking their fingers. So what's needed very often is patience.
Right. And to the impatient people, you would say, you're only making it worse. Yeah.
Yes, as happened. I mean, I think there's very good reason to believe that female genital cutting would not exist in Kenya today if the Presbyterians hadn't made that mistake in the 1930s.
Yeah.
I mean, it's on the way down and so on. So I'm not saying it.
Yeah.
But still.
It actually slowed down the process.
Slowed down the process. Look, many human rights interventions are conducted in such a way that what the people that they're conducted against feel that this is a kind of imperial, not very comprehending outsider who's also rather condescending. Yeah. Well, why would you do something if an imperial condescending outsider came and told you to do it? Yeah. You would do the exact opposite, right? You would resist. You would pick the practice up. You would say, and this has happened. I mean, I grew up in Ghana. Ghana's horribly homophobic at the moment, in part as a result of a lot of international criticism of African homophobia, which actually wasn't a very big thing until the criticism started. I grew up as a gay person in Ghana, I know that. People are more homophobic now than they were before these interventions. When I told my father, well, actually my sister told my father for me, that I was gay, he said, "Oh, I can get that. Sex is pleasurable."
Right.
That was the tradition. And he said, "But can you ask him, how can he give up the pleasure of sex with women?" Right. So he was worried about that. He wasn't moralized, and he was a Methodist church elder. So it's really important to intervene in intelligent ways and not to intervene in stupid ways. And that's what a cosmopolitan is placed to do, because the cosmopolitan is interested in the other people, right? And so enjoys discovering what they're like.
And I also hear you say they have a certain humility in,
the episteme.
Deciding also on what is a legitimate difference and what would not be. Yeah.
Yes. So let me be clear. I mean, there are many things. I think. Look, again, if I could flip my fingers, honor killing would stop tomorrow around the world, and it has stopped in some places. It was common in the Balkans in the early 20th century. It was more common in North Africa than it is now. But if you're going to campaign against it, you really need to understand what's going on. And one of the really important things about what's going on in many places where honor killings occur is that the people who do it actually already believe that it's wrong. They just think it's honorable.
Yeah. We'll get back to honor. But first, over to Charlotte.
I want to seamlessly segue into differences in cultural practices to differences in relation to identity. So in your work, you very explicitly reject this idea of essentialism, that there's not a characteristic or trait that grounds our membership in the identity groups to which we belong. So just because I'm a woman, that doesn't mean I'm naturally caring, and so on. And I think you think we should think of identity in a more flexible way. But perhaps a lot of the contemporary thinking about identity has moved back towards more essentialist notions. So I wondered if you could start off by telling us why you think essentialism is the wrong way to approach issues of identity.
Well, identities are, maybe I can start this way. This use of the word identity is an entirely modern phenomenon. This word is not used in this way before the 1950s. It's a post-Second World War phenomenon, and it grows out of work in sociology and psychology. The thought that is captured in the development of that discourse is that race and gender and sexual orientation and religion and nationality are things of the same kind. Mm-hmm. If you'd said that to most people in the 1930s, they'd have said, what kind is that? I mean, some of these things are connected with family, some of them aren't. Some of them connected with, vary across space and time a lot, some of them don't. How can you say that they're all things of the same kind? But so one should inquire, as one looks at a form of identity, how bad essentialism is about that form of identity. And maybe there are some forms of identity where you can find some thing that a philosopher might regard as an essential property of people of that kind. I haven't had a good time coming up with such examples, but I'm a fallibilist. I'm open to the possibility that I might be wrong about that. But of all the ones that matter, it's clearly not true, because the ones that matter are the big ones, the ones that have many members, and those groups are all incredibly internally inhomogeneous, heterogeneous. And one of the ways they're heterogeneous is that among the trans people, some are Dutch and some are Chinese, some are Lutheran and some are Catholic, many are atheists, and so on. So what they have in common in some sense is that they're trans, but again, we don't all agree about who counts as trans. There's disputes about boundaries. So if we can't agree about the boundaries, we can't agree about the essence, because we don't know what the question is we're asking when we ask whether they all have some property in common. Well, that depends on who they all are, for one thing. So one reason for being against essentialism about the big identity is just the empirical fact of the inhomogeneity. Also, I think that, and this is a good example of a place where social psychology is really helpful, empirical social psychology. The ways in which, there's a form of thinking which is natural to humans, which you find in kids of 3 and 4, which is, it's a way of forming generalizations, which are expressed in natural languages in what linguists call generics. Tigers eat people, elephants are large, stuff like that. Well, that's a very basic form of generalization, and if you present 4-year-olds with a bunch of people and you start making generic remarks about them, they will come to think that there's something inside those people that explains why they're all like, and so they will, if you tell them that one person of that kind does something, they'll be inclined to make the induction that they all do, or that most of them do, or something. Now, again, bad idea, but idea built into our brains, so dealing with it is very challenging, and that's one of the places where realism about what our psychology is actually like is really important. A lot of the problems of what we think of as problems of stereotyping are consequences of this cognitive mechanism. They don't actually derive from people having motivated reasons for stereotyping. They derive from the fact that unless you stop it, the default mode of generalization, which we start with, is this very imperfect one. Now, that's one of the reasons why I think it's almost impossible, and maybe I'm going to get a bit nerdy here, but it's almost impossible, I think, to give an adequate semantics for generics, because they're not actually guided by truth claims. They're guided by something else. And my friend Sarah Jane Leslie wrote a great dissertation about this, and there's a lot of interesting research on it, including research on children. But, and I don't have a theory of generics, and I don't accept any theory of generics that I've ever heard. But we use them, and they're a default way of thinking, and they create problems. Why did I say that? What were we? What did it?
Well, essentialism.
Oh, about essentialism.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the ways in which the thing that I criticize as essentialism arises. It's out of this cognitive mechanism. So the first thing we need to do is to keep track of that mechanism and be careful. And one thing you can do, for example, is it turns out with children, if you don't want them to essentialize a group, you shouldn't make generic statements about it. That is, you should say, some Catholics like this. You shouldn't say Catholics like this, or many Catholics like this. Or if you're really good, 73% of Catholics, according to a recent report from the Pew Charitable Trust, think this. Because if you, Sarah Jane actually did some very nice experiments with some psychologist colleagues about this. If you make a lot of generic, they invented a kind of person, a fictional kind, and they showed the kids pictures of these kind. And they divided the kids into two groups, and one lot they said a lot of generic things about, and the other lot they didn't. They avoided generics. And a couple of days later, the kids who'd heard a lot of generics were told, this Zarpi, was what they called the thing, this Zarpi likes cheese. Those kids said, oh, Zarpis like cheese. The kids who hadn't heard the generic said, oh, he likes cheese. So actually there's behavior around children that can make a difference to these things. So, but that's why I think essentialism is unhelpful, because the essentialism about kinds of people. There are things like gold where the properties of each sample of gold are to be explained by an inner thing that's in all of them, right? So essentialism about gold is perfectly fine. I'm not saying essentialism is in general wrong, but essentialism about social kinds tends to be wrong because there's huge internal inhomogeneity in the kinds. And also, even if it's true, for example, it's true that African Americans tend to vote for Democrats. But it's not true because there's some inner racial essence that makes them vote for Democrats. There's a social explanation, which doesn't refer to any inner essence. It just refers to the fact that they identify as African Americans.
Is this where you make this distinction between metaphysical identities and ethical identities in some of your work?
Yes.
So I think it seems like you think that identities are, to some extent, or identity categories are kind of built into the way we think, and they're often useful in these sort of shorthand ways. We have to deal with a lot of different people, and so if we know that greengrocers sell fruit and vegetables, then we can interact with the greengrocer in the right way. But do you think that in a kind of an ideal world, we would dispense with sort of broader identity categories of race and gender and nationhood and so on, or do you think they can still serve a useful purpose, perhaps if we think about them in different ways?
I'd answer that question on a case-by-case basis. But let's remind ourselves of a useful thing that one identity category does. So one useful thing that one identity category does is that for many people, a national identity gives them motivation and they think reason to care about other people of the same nation. I'm a typical New Yorker. Typical New Yorker, upper middle class New Yorker. I pay much more into the federal tax system than I get out in services. Don't mind, because that money is going to look after poor people in my community, and my community in that case is the United States. It's going to Mississippi and Alabama and Alaska. That's fine by me because they're my fellow Americans. What reason would I have to direct money to them if I didn't, in some sense, think of us as some kind of we? Because then I could either go back to being a utilitarian and say, well, everybody has concerns, so, And the way the world is organized, it's useful. And that's why national identities develop, basically in Europe starting in the 18th century, they developed with the rise of sort of democratic ideas, because if a people is going to govern itself, they have to think of themselves as a people. If it's just up to the king what happens, he can just tell you what to do, right? And you don't, all you need to know, he has an army. And a prison. But if I'm going to be persuaded to do things for other people, not just commanded to do things for other people, I have to have some sense of us as, you know.
Yeah.
And that basic, the positive side of identity psychology means that it would be impossible, I think, to live in the modern world without it, because we live, our political communities are communities of strangers and have to be communities of strangers because they're too big. Aristotle thought that you shouldn't have a polis bigger than about 10,000 free men, and then they could have 10,000 women and a bunch of slaves as well. But that, because he thought up to about 10,000, you could know the character of your fellow citizens. Well, I think 10,000 is a lot for that, but he was optimistic. But nobody thinks that you can do it for Switzerland.
But what about, I wonder, for something like gender? Do you think that there's also an importance to that kind of identity?
Yes, I mean, so yes, because it's not, because I think, but this is an empirical question, I think that people's, so one way it's going to matter is, I think that people's sexual desires are going to be organized in part around features of the bodies of other people, whatever concepts they have in their societies. That probably should be true, otherwise natural selection isn't doing a very good job. But that's, so I think the thought that we could just abandon gender would leave us a little bit lost in the organization of our sexual lives and our lives, more importantly as the creators of families and so on. But that's a tiny reason by comparison with the reasons that have been hypothesized. And we should, and I'm only insisting upon it because I want to be empiricist about it. I want to say, well, it depends on what would happen if we tried to get rid of it. Would the world be better if we tried to get rid of it? I think the world has become much better since I was a child because we've reshaped the gender system quite radically since I was a child. And when I mean, just simple facts, I'm not a very good typist. Why? And my sisters are. Why? Because when we were growing up, girls of our class got taught to type because they might be secretaries, and boys didn't because they weren't going to be secretaries, right? Well, so I lost out there because turned out everybody needs to type now, and I can't get a secretary to do it for me. So, and meanwhile, my sisters aren't secretaries either. So, I mean, that's a small example. My point is that, in other words, we put gender in all these places where it had no business. Also, we ignored, in our thinking about gender, the incredible diversity of the ways in which people's sexual bodies are connected with desire, right? So we didn't have, even more invisible perhaps until recently than trans people, are asexual people. People don't have sexual desires, right? We just assumed that if you were a man, you had and should have sexual desires directed towards women, right? That was our picture of sexuality. Well, people aren't like that, it turns out. It turns out that there are lots of people who have, I mean, I'm expecting us to move away from thinking that the binary homosexual, heterosexual, or the ternary thing, homosexual, bisexual, heterosexual, because that's a way of thinking about sexuality that focuses on the gender of the object of desire, and that turns out not to be how everybody's sexuality is organized. So, and these are things where empirical social science, empirical psychology is enormously important in trying to figure out. Trans people have been pushing us to recognize that there's a way of reconfiguring the system, which is of no cost to me as a cis person, but enormously liberating for them. So let's do it. And that's a place where essentialism is highly unhelpful.
Yeah.
Oh, you have a vagina, so you must be a woman. You have a penis, you must be a man. That's why? I mean, who said? I mean, some people think God said, but if you don't think God said, who said? And why did they say it? And maybe we should argue with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this seems to connect to your idea about identities being things that are up for social negotiation and labels not just belonging to the people that fall under that label.
Very important, I think. Concepts belong to the people who use them, and both the people who are trans and the people who aren't trans and the people who don't know whether they're trans, all of them are, it's a concept for all of them. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to change the way we think about gender, you have to persuade everybody. You have to listen to everybody, but you also have to persuade everybody. I myself feel well addressed on that topic by trans people. I feel that they've persuaded me, they've given me arguments, I understand what they're saying, as far as I can tell, and I'm happy for them. That sounds condescending. I think it's right that they should be able to do what they want to do. But they did the right thing. They made arguments. They articulated their experience. They talked to people about what it was like. So I think, and the same is true, if we have a system of racial categories in the United States, famously. They don't suit everybody. Mm-hmm. One reason they don't suit everybody is that since anti-miscegenation laws were declared unconstitutional in 1967, 6 times as many people marry across racial boundaries as did in the 1960s. And so there are lots of people whose parents are of different racial categories. And the old system kind of assumed that you got your racial category because your parents both had the same one. Well, that's not true. It was never true, but it was closer to the truth at one point. Now it's not closer. So we need to figure out whether multiracial people should be recognized in some way if they want to be recognized, and ask them why they want to be recognized and what they want to be recognized for. Barack Obama had a white Kansan mother, a distinguished anthropologist as it happens, but still a white woman from Kansas. He thinks he's black, right? But many other people think he's mixed race. I don't say who's right, but I say, in thinking about who's right, we should ask the question, what does Barack Obama think? And why does he think that? And if it suits him, I don't think it's a good idea to correct him. Mm-hmm. But I don't, he wrote 2 autobiographical books, so you can figure out why it matters to him the way it is. He once told me that, so my first sort of book on these general topics is called In My Father's House. It was about black identity in Africa and the diaspora. And he told me that when he wanted to publish his first autobiographical book, he said, I want to call it In My Father's House. And they said, another guy with an African father and a white mother has already written that book, so you have to give it a different title. So he complained to me about having forced him to. Actually, I think it's a very good title, the title of his book, but anyway.
So I maybe have one more question about identity, and then we'll move back to Daphne. But so just on this question about how we negotiate social identities, and you've just said that you shouldn't tell Barack Obama that he's wrong and actually he's mixed race, he's not black, and so on. But if we're thinking about specifically how we live out our identities, sometimes these can come into conflict with one another. So if a woman is very vocally saying, because I'm a woman, I want to remain at home and be subservient to my husband and so on, it seems, at least from some of your work, that you think that we should kind of refrain from critique to a certain point. But then in other aspects, it seems like critique is necessary because identities are relational, and the way someone else lives their identity category, if I'm also part of that category, then that affects my possibilities for being able to do that. So, if someone's held up as saying, oh, look, this is what all women want to do, and then you say, no, because, well, we shouldn't be essentialist, and we should make identities work for us. To what extent do you think it's possible to kind of engage in this kind of critique, given your other commitments to being respectful and allowing people to define themselves and so on?
Well, the key thought is that these are things settled by everybody in dialogue. We should give special weight to the people who have special stakes. So we should pay special attention when trans people ask about trans identity, because they have a stake in it that the rest of us may not have. Now, of course, some people have a big stake in cis identity, and they may not, and that may pull in different directions. When listening to both of them may pull in different directions. And I think the answer to that is, it's sort of not a matter of a priori reflection. You have to have the dialogue and see what happens. The thing I'd say about sort of people wanting to perform more traditional gender roles is, in that discussion, I think it's not disrespectful to remind them that that what they think is to some degree the result of an ideological system. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong. Well, I do think, I guess I think I would like to persuade people that equal relations within couples are preferable to less equal ones. Though I understand that there are people who, well, I understand that there can be something gained by someone who says, I don't want the burden of those responsibilities, and my partner's willing to take them on. So, and it turns out that the ones my partner's willing to take on are the ones that are traditionally assigned to men. So you know, go ahead, Joe, get on with it. I understand that that's a possible situation, as I say. But I think that if you think about, and you know, if my life had been slightly different, I love children. I think I might have wanted to raise children, being the primary parent. If we'd had children, I think I might have wanted to be the parent. But we're both men, so that's obviously, it had to be done by a man. But, and I certainly don't think there's anything wrong with being the primary caregiver of children. And I think that some critiques of it are unfair, unkind, and unhelpful. But to know what to say, you have to listen to the people who are making all the claims and figure out what it's doing in their lives.
But maybe there's also an issue if they're kind of presenting them in very essentializing terms.
Yes.
Like, because I'm doing this, then you can say no.
You can say, I think then you can say that's not true. I mean, that's what you think is going on in your life. Yeah. But there's been, sociology is now more than a century old. And these things have been studied. And that theory of what's going on is a theory. And the fact that it's a theory held by someone in the society is interesting, but it doesn't mean it's correct. And you would encourage people to respond, people would be more willing to respond a little bit more positively to that kind of critique, I think, if they were more generally fallibilist in their, I mean, I think people think that, so there's a way of talking now in which you speak about, which actually, I mean, in the context of feminism, it goes back to Simone de Beauvoir, speaking about lived experience, right? Part 2 of her book is called Lived Experience of a Woman. And that comes out of German phenomenology and so on. And the very same idea is used by Frantz Fanon to talk about black identity, and it's used by Sartre to talk about Jewish identity. Well, it just seems to me, as it were, false to say that I know what it's like to be a man because I'm a man. I know what it's like to be this man, but there are ways of being a man that I don't understand. And they are ways of being a man, but they're not my way. And I need to, and if I need to live in a world with people who live that other way, I need to try and figure out what their way is, and I hope they'll try to understand mine. And that thought is made easier by anti-essentialism and by encouraging people to, as it were, speak for themselves and not for essentialized categories of people, not to say, well, what we women want is, I mean, you can be authorized by a group of women to represent them, and then you can say what we women want is this, because they They sent you to be the representative. But you don't get to represent women just because you're a woman, any more than you get to represent gay people because you're gay or black people because you're black. And all this is stressing the kind of dialogical character shaped by the normative thought that the dialogue needs to be respectful.
And we should all be phenomenologists. This is what I'm hearing.
Did you? I think, I had one last question about respectful speech and interaction, and it was about the elections, but maybe it's good that our time is also almost up, and I think we should also open the floor. Wouldn't be surprised if there's gonna be another reflection on the elections, but yeah, I just want to open up the floor for questions because otherwise we'll run out of time. So I'll get a microphone, Nina, if you could walk around. Ooh, is this on? Oh, it's gonna be turned on. Please be concise. As a friend of mine said, the question usually has up to 10 words, ends with a question mark. And let's make sure that we can have as many people ask their questions as we can. Okay, so there's one here at the front.
Yeah, just about the election of Trump. What's your opinion? Which lies bind the American people with Trump? I've got here your book, The Lies That Bind, Creed, Country, Color, Class or Culture. Was it creed, was it country, was it color, was it class, or was it culture?
Clear question, thank you.
So that book doesn't talk about the most salient kind of political identity in the United States today, which is partisan political identity. What the political psychologists call partyism is a situation in which people's identification either as Republican and Democrat or as conservative and progressive or liberal dominates their other identities. And that's what's happened in many countries. It hasn't just happened in the United States. It's true in Spain, it's true in England, as we saw with Brexit, I think. So a political identity becomes the organizing force for a kind of in-group, out-group psychology that's extremely negative. So in the 1950s in the United States, I don't remember the exact number, but less than a third of people thought that interracial marriages were okay. It is now, I think, 95%. So that sense of distinct and hostile groups, which is reflected in the idea that, well, we can't marry them, right, has been transferred to political identity. So if you ask people now, is it okay, if you ask Democrats, would you mind if your son married a Republican? Somewhere between, depends on the poll, but sometimes as many as 60% of them say, yes, of course I'd mind, that would be terrible. And the same for if you ask Republicans about marrying Democrats. So all the sort of classic sociological measures of social distance and antagonism now apply to a high degree, an increasing degree, between, roughly speaking, Republicans and Democrats or conservatives and liberals in the United States. That's why it just happened that I left the United States before the election. Was it the night before? Yes. And just in case you're worried about my citizenship, I did vote before I left. And you can guess who I voted for. I sat down in a bar at the airport where I got there early with a white woman from Massachusetts, as I discovered in our conversation, though I knew she was white when I looked at her, who was slightly tipsy and so more self-revelatory than perhaps she intended to be, who revealed to me that A, that she was going to vote for Trump, and B, that she thought he was crazy.
Wow.
And then and also, a bad husband, and she had various other bad things. In fact, she didn't say anything good about him. That's what once you're in the partyist frame of mind, you just don't care what your candidate is like. You just vote for your party. Mm. And what the political psychology shows is that if you want to predict how strongly people feel about these things, it turns out it's not connected with how strongly they feel about actual political issues. Of course, there's a package of views that are typical of Republicans, but essentialism about Republicans is a very bad idea. Republicans have lots of diversity, internal, on the questions that politics is about. And of course, Democrats do as well. So the antagonism isn't even ideological exactly. It's partyist. And I've been going around saying, long before I knew that Trump was going to run again for the presidency, that you can't run a republic that way. You have to have a sense of we the people. And if you think that it's more important that the other side lose than that your country flourish, which is what a person who thinks it's okay to elect a crazy person to the presidency is effectively saying, then something's gone wrong with your political system. And as I say, this is not, it matters in the United States, and maybe the United States matters more because we throw our weight around so much. But it's gone on in other countries as well. So that would lead you to hypothesize that whatever explains it, it isn't something special about the United States. And my guess is that it does have something to do with the way social media work. But it has, in the United States, also to do with something that may not be happening elsewhere, which is a geographical sorting. People are moving to neighborhoods and towns which are dominantly of whatever the party is that they... Now, they're not doing it because of that always, but that's because a dominantly Republican town is going to have features that appeal to certain people, and a dominantly Democratic town is going to have features that appeal to a different kind of person. And if you have a society in which the different political groups don't have social lives together, they don't know anybody of the other social group, they're of the other party socially, then you can't build social trust of the sort that's necessary in a democratic society where we have to accept that we live with people who have different views from us about policy, but we also have to accept that what they matter. We can't just write them off because they don't agree with us. We have to figure out, that's what political compromise is about. We have to figure out things that are not too awful for them and not too awful for us. That's the best we can do. And if you are in this partyist frame of mind, you won't do that. You'll just try to win. Now, right now, the Republicans have won largely, I think, because, the main explanations are two. One is people wrongly, but nevertheless, this is what they think the economy is not in great shape, and typically Americans vote against the incumbent party when the economy is not going well. And two, President Biden is very unpopular, and she's his successor. Yeah. Why President Biden is very unpopular is very opaque to me. I don't really understand it. But it's a fact.
We have three questions lined up.
Just to say that, so the point is, it's central to understanding this, that identity, that we think of identity as political. No, money played a role because it affected who got to see what ads. But so did, and President Putin played a role by his, he has people who circulate false stories through Facebook that raise the level of antagonism between left and right in the United States. This is, I hope you know this. It's a completely well-known fact. We know the names of some of the people in Moscow who do this. We know what building they work in. So there are lots of things going on, but they're all working by tweaking identity, and in particular they're tweaking partisan identity. So identity is the crucial variable here.
Yeah. Thank you. Next question.
Thank you for the talk, professors. It was very, very interesting. I was just wondering your thoughts on what happens when identities clash, and more specifically, you talked about Obama, but what if the black community itself didn't accept him as a member, even though he himself saw himself as a member?
Good. So, I mean, that's just one of the ways in which identities work, is that there are disputes about who's in, right? And it can be very painful to be excluded from a group that you identify with. And since, in general, causing pain to people is a bad thing, if you're in a group that's doing that, you should think about it. You should think, well, is this a good thing for us to be doing, refusing this person? Because what's being refused in the case of ethnic identities isn't just a label. It's participation in institutions and experiences of solidarity and so on, which you're denying. And that's a big thing to deny people. I mean, so there's this weird thing about racial identities, right, as they have been configured in the Atlantic world anyway, which is that people are inclined to, people of minority ethnic groups are inclined to be enormously socially generous to other people of the group, even if they're strangers. One of my most iconic experiences for me in the United States, which I didn't go to till I was in my late 20s, but I went because my best friend, who was an African American, invited me, and I met his family and so on. And I couldn't be more different from them, obviously. I didn't grow up in the United States. And I mean, they came from West Virginia. His father swept the floors in a mill, and so on. But they were very generous to me because they thought of me as black, right? So I was no essence that we shared, as it were. But the label, and then I found that in that town, a very small town in West Virginia, if I walked down the street and black people walked by, they smiled at me, right? Just an expression of racial solidarity in a state with a long history of racism. And so, even in New York City, which is very much a city of strangers, quite often people of color smile at me. Maybe because I'm smiling at them, I don't know. But so there are all these weird things that you deny someone if you don't recognize them as a group. And I'm not saying, I don't know whether I think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a thing, for sure.
Okay, we had another question there, Nina, right in front of you, and then we have two here in the front after. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you for your time and your explanation tonight. I really appreciate your concept of cosmopolitan. It's really interesting in nowadays world. But my question as philosopher student is that your concept seems to be based on logical and empirical knowledge, a Kantian approach. I really like that. But nowadays we seem to be more emotional driven, and the question about elections showed that question. As philosopher student, my question is, what can I do in the future, or philosophers, what are our responsibility to try to motivate people to think more logical and empirical? Thank you.
I mean, so there's, professional philosophers typically these days operate in at least two distinct ways that are relevant to answering your question. One is we teach students, and we teach them to think in these ways. I don't think we should tell them what to think, but I think we should give them better tools for thinking whatever they decide to think for themselves. Now, but that's the truth, that's the duty of all teachers, university teachers. If the physics professors don't leave open the possibility that they're wrong about something, there's no point in teaching any more physicists. And if that's true, physics is over. Don't need any more physicists. But it isn't true, and so you shouldn't assume, you've got to give people tools and so on, but at a certain point, it's up to them to do the experiments and try out the ideas and see what they can come up with. But so in the particular case of philosophy, in part because while there's lots of philosophy and by no means is it the case that all of it is normative, we are especially placed in relation to the normative. And so with our students, helping them to think in a systematic and responsible way about ethics is a really important thing we do. But we also talk to the world, some of us, right? I write a column for the New York Times every Sunday. I say things about what people should do. But usually when I say what they should do, I give them reasons for why they should do it. And it's the reasons that I really care about. It's communicating the thought that these are the kinds of reasons are relevant to whatever the problem is that the person is. That's the thing I care about. I don't really care whether people agree with the advice I give. But I hope I'm giving them ways of thinking about not the particular problem that was put to me. That's only helpful for the person who wrote the letter. But that's, you know, I have a million other readers. And if it's useful for them, it's because they're given tools that I learned from philosophy.
Great. So we have 2 questions here in the front. Maybe that one first is...
Thank you, Professor Appiah. I have a question about reparations for slavery. So you wrote a paper in 2004 arguing that a lot of reparationist demands could be addressed with forward-looking measures. But a lot has happened in reparations since then. There's been CARICOM's claim, there's been the Black Lives Matter and ADOS movements, there's been Commonwealth countries just last month saying they're owed reparations for slavery. So I was wondering if your views have changed on this at all.
So one context in which philosophers can be unhelpful is in contexts where there's something people want to do, and it might be a good thing they do it, but their theory of why it should be done is a terrible theory. And the philosopher's likely to feel he has to point that out. So I think that individual reparations to descendants of slaves as a tactic now, I mean, slavery was abolished in the United States in the 1860s. So we're talking about great-great-great-great-grandchildren and so on. I think there's no clear way to set up a system for doing that for a bunch of reasons. I mean, here's one, which I mentioned in that paper, I think. About a third, well, no. Yeah. About a third, at least a third, of the descendants of American slaves today are white people. That is, they are socially white. What do we owe them on this theory? You have to have an answer to that question. Similarly, almost way more African Americans are descendants of slaveholders, because in the first half of the 19th century, the main way that non-100% African people were produced was by male slaveholders having sex with female slaves, as happened with Thomas Jefferson. The Hemmings family are the descendants of a slave of Thomas Jefferson's with whom he had sex. She was also the half-sister of his wife because his father-in-law did the same thing. So trying to individualize this, trying to say, well, you get this right because you're descended from a slave, or you get this right because this obligation because you're descended from a slaveholder, that strikes me as, that's not going to, it'll produce something that doesn't do any good, but also, I don't know how you would do it. I don't know how you would draw the lines. I think it's fine. I have more sympathy for the imperial history claims, because there's a continuous entity, namely, say, in my case, Asante or the Gold Coast. I mean, there are a bunch of continuous entities which we can be the subject of the claim and can receive some form of repair. And I think the same is true in the United States. If you're going to do it in the United States, I wouldn't do it by tracing your ancestry back, which is what the IDOS people want to do. I would do it by saying, what's your racial identity now? And that's a continuing, it's a very interesting and weird historical object, black people in America, because the rules of who's in and out shifted over time. But it's still a historical object, and we can say with, I don't know, 95% clarity who's in it. Is it a good idea? Well, I mean, so suppose we agree that those people are actually owed something, that there's some normative basis for the argument they're owed something. Not everything that there's a normative basis for doing is a good idea. And my sense is that these claims increase rather than reduce racial antagonism. And I favor strategies that reduce racial antagonism. And I think forward-looking strategies which are based on, which don't really have to answer these historical justice claims, because the forward-looking strategy is to say that Americans owe each other a society in which everybody, independent of their racial identity, has a decent shot at a life as a successful free person. And that will allow you to take account of class injustices. It will allow you to take account of injustices due to gender and sexual orientation. It will allow you to take account of any, because you're trying to create a world in which none of those things get in the way of being able to make a life of dignity in which you are in charge of your own fate, as it were. So I don't find many of the arguments about exactly what the claims of justice are super clear or compelling. But my point is, even if I did, there would be a separate question, not really a philosophical question, but a practical political question, of whether these are the right claims to pursue. Because, last thing to say about this, the history of humanity is the history of massive injustice. Yeah. There are so many unresolved injustices, right? There's the colonial ones, there's the racial ones within places like the United States or Brazil. There are all the people who suffered because they were gay, and there are all the people who suffered because they were women who were denied opportunities, and there are all the people who were Native American, and so on. It's an endless list. And the one thing we can't do is help the ones who are dead. We can't do anything about that. And so that injustice, which could have been resolved while they were alive, we could have repaired it. That we don't. There's no chance of that. We've lost that opportunity. So that's another reason for focusing on the living, I think. It's that we might be able to do something about the injustices suffered by current people. We might be able to repair them. So I said that was the last thing I'm going to say, but let me say one more thing, which is that I like the thought that reparations is about repair. It's about rebuilding or building decent relations of equality and justice with people. And so it's not really, it turns out that sometimes money does that, but it's not really about money. It's about repair. And relational repair is harder than money, but also more important, and something that we should think about. And it's something that we can contribute to individually as well as by supporting policies. Okay, if we keep it very brief, we can... that was addressed
which
to me,
will be
not
difficult. Yeah. It's also very interesting, but yeah, people may have other places to go. Please.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to be brief with the question as well. So you talked a lot about respect, patience, dialogue, and I guess these things function best if there's a symmetrical preparedness to do this. But we might be living in a period where not everyone agrees to these rules of the game. And I was just wondering what are your thoughts on this asymmetry? How should those of us who would like to pursue the path of patience, respect, dignity, and so on, deal with opponents who might not share these values.
Yes. The American poet Robert Frost, who wasn't really a liberal, said that a liberal is someone who can't take his own side in an argument. So there are political asymmetries as well as just the asymmetries that you're talking about. I mean, in many contexts, there's someone who's in a position of power, and they don't want to listen. And there's the person who doesn't have any power who's perfectly willing to talk, for example. As I like to say, conversation is an activity that involves consenting adults. You can't do it if the other party isn't, as Hume would have said, conversable. But you can try to do things to make people more conversable than they are. And one way you can do that is by something that's a bit risky, which is making yourself a little bit vulnerable to them by entering into a dialogue in good faith, which they may not be yet. They may not yet be engaged in good faith. I think, but in the end, the point of the conversation is to be able to be open to one another, and if the other party isn't open to that, the conversation has no point, and you should have to stop. And there are certain things. I mean, back to the question of sort of what the things are that we don't tolerate. At a certain point, I think it's good to talk to people to try to persuade them not to do the worst things, the things that are gross human rights violations. But in the end, if that doesn't work, you just have to try and stop them. Because that's a moral demand too. And I just think some people are a little bit too quick to rule out the possibility that that'll work, that they'll get. But yeah, in the end, if I think it would have been right to intervene in Rwanda before the genocide, rather than continuing dialogue with Hutu power.
So there is a last resort at some point. I think on that note, before I thank you, I just want to repeat that if you want to have a wonderful memory of this lovely gathering, you can buy a book, have it signed. Also, have a look at all the wonderful Studium Generale programs which are coming up. And for now, I just want to really thank you all for being here, for a very engaged discussion, and thank you so much, Anthony, for a very insightful evening.
Well, thank you both very much.